Today we're going to talk about quantum ogres, what they are, and why they destroy player freedom in your role-playing game campaigns. Hi everyone, I'm Gary and welcome back. Today we are going to talk about quantum ogres, which are a specific type of railroading and a really kind of bad thing for game masters to do. So before we start, let's just say that whenever I give game mastery advice, I do my best to not use any sort of absolutes, like this is really, really terrible, or this is absolutely perfect, and you definitely should do this, or you definitely shouldn't do that. And the reason I try and avoid absolutes in really simple terms is because there is, there's exceptions to every single rule, and this is effectively a very human activity, and there's lots of room for discussion and negotiation and discourse, and everyone's table's different because everyone's different, and every table's made up of different people. That's kind of a bit of a caveat before we get going. Now, let's just define what a quantum ogre is. As I said, it's a type of railroading, and where you force the players to play a particular narrative. But what a quantum ogre is where you effectively move an encounter that you have planned and place it in front of the player characters no matter what. And the idea is that if something is quantum, it is. I don't know anything about like quantum physics or anything like that. I'm like really like not learned in that field. But what I understand to be about the word quantum is something that basically doesn't exist until it is interacted with, observed, like noticed in some way. It's like a liminal thing. And then an ogre is just a monster. So the idea is you have an ogre encounter, say like 3 ogres, and you've decided that the player characters are going to encounter this group of 3 ogres, no matter what happens. So they go left in the dungeon, they come to a chamber, and it's got 3 ogres in it. But what if they go right? And they might have a discussion about which way they're going to go. Well, they come to a chamber with 3 ogres in it, and it's not that it's 2 different chambers with 3 ogres in it. It's the same chamber, and it really doesn't matter what the player characters actually would like to do, but you're actually abdicating responsibility in terms of you're taking away their freedom as players and making them have this particular encounter regardless. Now, the term quantum ogre comes from a kind of blog post. The earliest one that I could find was from 2011. So it is a kind of marked term in game mastery that has been part of the discourse for over 10 years. It is quite well embedded, but I do think it's a really good articulation of a problem that some game masters bad practice that some game masters find themselves engaging with, sometimes not even really realizing that they're doing it, and sometimes can do it not really wanting to do it, not wanting to kind of be a bad game master, but there are conditions that increase the chance of you as a game master kind of going, okay, I think I'm just gonna use the quantum ogre. I think I'm just gonna kind of make them engage with this regardless. And I think there's basically a couple of reasons for that. But before we talk about that, let's just say the reason quantum ogres are worse than just ordinary railroading is because while railroading, any type of railroading, removes player freedom, and that's the point of this medium. That's what makes tabletop role-playing games different from any other type of game, including video role-playing games, is the fact that you can do anything. So as soon as you get rid of that particular quality of the tabletop role-playing game, you're effectively not playing a tabletop role-playing game anymore. And I don't know what you're playing, but you've kind of like extracted the best quality out of it. But what makes Quantum Ogre worse is that it is really deceitful. And we don't need to be deceitful as game masters. We are putting on a show for our friends. A game master is first amongst equals, of course, but we don't need to be deceitful. We don't want to engage in deceit. And, there are certain elements of a game that we are privy to that our players are not. For example, if we're running a mystery, we don't want them to know all the details of the mystery, right? That's the point. They're investigating it. Same for, a dungeon light. We know what's in the next room and the players don't. But the players generally know that you're withholding that information from them. They don't know what the information is, but they know you are withholding some information from them. Even mechanics that are like just GM facing. So we talk about player facing mechanics quite a lot, but there are certain mechanics that might be just game master facing. Random encounter table rolls, for example. The outcome of search tests might be, or listen tests might just be behind the game master screen. So then the players don't know whether they succeeded or not. So whether they should keep searching or not becomes a kind of question on risk management, as whether they should keep searching in a particular room, even though there's wandering monsters, around the corner. But even then, the players are in on the conceit, right? They know that you're rolling that in secret. Problem with the quantum ogres, they don't know that you're doing this. And again, we don't want to be deceitful. So why do some game masters use quantum ogres? Well, it is usually for a couple of reasons. One is it's probably for a sense of control. If you feel like, okay, I don't have much time to prep my game, so I'm just gonna I know I'm gonna play him for 3 hours. I'm gonna just knock out 6 encounters or however much you think you're gonna get through in that amount of time in your session. I'll just plan them, and then no matter what happens, they will engage it. And I can just do this tonight, just so then, give myself a bit of a break. I've only got like half an hour to prep or 20 minutes to prep before the game. But I think that this is effectively, it's too egregious to kind of ignore, and you really, really need to resist it, because I think it so totally destroys the player agents that you must resist using these. Even if it gives you a sense of control, even if it gives you a sense of mastery over the content, I think what you will be better off doing is just, as I've mentioned before in a previous video, my top 5 game master techniques about pointing the camera. You should just start the session where you're pointing the camera at what you want them to interact with. You shouldn't be kind of just forcing them or tricking them into engaging with what you've planned. That's just kind of vociferous and corrosive to, well, basically everything the game is. The other reason I think is, I mentioned in my last video, again, link in the top right, about prep, that quite often game masters, especially inexperienced game masters, they over prep they do this kind of tier 2 prep, which is like world building, and not enough time is spent on session planning. But actually, I think sometimes Quantum Ogres come about as a result of like the opposite, like too much session planning. And what happens is quite often, if you find yourself tempted to place an encounter, to warp the situation of the world to force players to engage with something that you prepped, well, that's probably because, you're still stressed about your prep, even though you've had enough time. It's probably because you are planning contingencies, which is like really the worst thing to do ever. And what I mean by that is you're writing out to yourself or thinking about, okay, if they do this, then I will put this in front of them. But if they do X, then this will happen. But if they do Y, then this will happen. If they do Z, then this will happen. You really can't plan contingencies. You can just really plan sort of hazards and obstacles for the players. That's what an encounter is. And then you just sit, once you've set up the obstacle, if it's combat or negotiation, whatever, you sit back as the game master and let them figure out how to work through it. So I think sometimes if you're pouring too much into your session prep, then what happens is, it's not necessarily that you become selfishly precious about the narrative. It's just that you become worried that you haven't accounted for something that could happen. So therefore, you make sure that you definitely have accounted for what could happen by just forcing particular contents. Now, it is worth saying that there are obviously encounters that are definitely going to happen to the players that are not Quantum Ogres. So, for example, but they're not usually encounters. They're usually events. And what I mean by that is, say the players are investigating like a snake cult. And they have really irritated the cultists, right? They've been investigating like temples all over town, like secret temples, and they maybe killed a few kind of low-ranking priests and cultists, and maybe exposed a minor noble or two. And the cult has decided that was the end. That was the last session. You've decided, okay, the cult are really annoyed with the player characters. They know who they are, and what they're going to do is they're going to try and attack the player characters. They're going to try and kill them, like silence them forever. And so at some point in your session, they are going to get attacked, but you haven't decided where. You haven't decided the conditions of the encounter. You've just decided that this event is going to happen because it makes sense for the narrative, but also for the setting, and those two things working in tangent create verisimilitude, and that's what you want. It might be that they attack them, in a kind of alleyway. It might be that they attack them in broad daylight in the market, but you haven't decided before the session. It might be really interesting, depending on the actions at the beginning of the session. It might be that they attack them when they are the player characters when they are sleeping and they're not wearing their armor, because that can be really interesting and dynamic. But you haven't pre-planned a very specific thing. And what's important there is that event encounter is sort of is in response to the player's actions. It's not just like a random encounter that you are forcing them to have no matter what. I think primarily, though, the reason that anyone would use a Quantum Ogre is because and when I was going to say it's because of poor table management, but I don't mean that as an indictment of any particular player or game master. Maybe just a bit of an experience. And what I mean by that is that they usually come about as a kind of breakdown in the social contract, right? And the social contract is this: when we play role-playing games, you turn up to the session, you can do anything that you want, right? You can play any character, you can, within the limits of the campaign, right? Within reason, but you can do anything, you can attempt any action. But we don't say this to each other, but you basically have to do the adventure that I planned. And that's the social contract. And we can pretend that is not the case. And I'm sure that some people in the comments will tell me that, I just let my players turn up and do whatever they want every session. It's like, that's cool too, right? It's too, right? Especially if you've got a bunch of guys who are like all theatre kids, right? And you really enjoy improv. But for the most part, players turn up and you present them with a couple of, maybe not just one hook, but a couple of hooks for maybe one or two adventures or a couple of adventures. And they choose something and then they do that thing. They don't, when you start and the mysterious stranger comes into the inn and says, "I need your help." It's a bit of a breakdown in that social contract then for the players to then go, no, we're just going to ignore him and just like we're going to leave town. It's like you see a lot of posts online where people find that kind of behavior a little bit frustrating. I think you probably more like to get that with very young players, like teenagers, who haven't really got that social acuity to accept that, no, we're playing the game. We're playing this that I've spent a bit of time prepping. It's one thing that when I've said before, which always sounds controversial, when I've said before that I always ask my players at the end of last session, if I'm running a sandbox, what they intend to do next session. And then I can plan that. And then if they turn up, within reason, they kind of have to just do what they told me they were going to do last session. They have to investigate or pursue the goal that they set for themselves at the end of last session, because that's the thing that I planned for. And that's just fairness, and that's just being a good player and being a good game master. And I think sometimes Quantum Ogres come about as a result of maybe not communicating that social contract enough, that actually I don't know what the player's going to do at all because I never bothered to ask them, or I never thought to ask them, and they don't understand that they kind of have to kind of go along with the plan to some extent. I'm going to give them a few options. They can choose whichever one they want, but they kind of have to go on options. And one of the options that I've set out for them, and it's kind of going, okay, I don't trust them to do that, and therefore I'm going to just not tell them, but I'm going to force them to do one of the options that I want. So that's what Quantum Ogres are, but they are really vociferous, and we have to kind of be consciously aware when they begin to creep into our DM prep, because I think they're one of those things where you can accidentally engage with it. I remember I once played in a game, a convention. It was a really good game. And at the beginning, we all the characters were meeting in a tavern, and a visitor came in, a kind of like adventure patron, to give the quest. And he, the guy running the game, who was amazing, went, "Oh, so do you accept?" And we all went, "Oh, yeah, we accept." And this was in the first 2 minutes of the game. And he went, "Oh, great, now we get to do the adventure." And I always think that to some extent, that was an amazing game, one of the best convention games I've ever played in. But I wouldn't have given the players an option in that particular context of a convention game. But to some extent, the social contract in a convention game where you're playing with strangers is more reinforced, because if you don't have the familiarity of friendship, you fall back on other expectations. But that is my thoughts on Quantum Ogres. Do you think, I'd be interested to know what people think. I always am, as I say, I was trying to respond to all the comments, but I would be interested to know if people think that particular genres or particular systems or particular play styles prompt this type of preparation, this type of game mastering, why you might think it's a problem in particular playstyles or games or genres. And are there any of those three things where you think a Quantum Ogre is actually a good thing, where you deceive the players and move the content in front of them? Or are what are the exceptional circumstances that would make this acceptable? Because I can't think of any, but I'm sure there are a few. But otherwise, until next time, thank you for listening. I'm Gary, and I'll speak with you again soon.